I'm Josh Allen, and welcome to the Baked In Podcast, where I sit down with industry innovators to uncover the unique ideas and values that are baked into their businesses and have led to extraordinary success. This podcast is presented by Busey Bank. Busey has been built on a foundation of strength and service, delivering expert advice and tailored solutions for businesses and individuals for over 155 years. What I love most about working with them is they're not only their bankers, but they're huge supporters of community. For example, since the inception of Busey's scholarship programs and partnerships with local universities, they've contributed over $250,000 in scholarships throughout their footprint. You can learn more about their community impact at busey.com. This is a fun one for me this week. It's episode 50. And my good friend and producer, JB Anderson from Gaslight Studios, joins me to discuss the state of the podcast 1 year in. We talk about many of the episodes, lessons learned, my growing admiration for the city of St. Louis, and my ultimate guest wish list. I'm super appreciative of the opportunity to keep telling these stories, and it's great to take a step back occasionally and remember why. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Remember, the best way to support the show is to simply follow it on your favorite podcast player and leave a comment. Let's go.
All right, Josh, 50th episode here. We're flipping the script a little bit.
Are we going to introduce you? I think we should.
My
good friend, JB Anderson from Gaslight Studios.
The Oz. The great Oz.
The guy behind the scenes for all 50 episodes so far, and hopefully the 200 more into the future. But
I've got a good feeling about this. Just based on our first 50, you know how like you're a vibe guy, right? You kind of you feed off of an environment, etc. The environment of this show, it's got a vibe. It feels good.
It's been fun. It's been a joy to do.
So I wanted to kick this one off in a Dickens style, kind of like, not that you're Scrooge or any version of Scrooge per se, but I thought that the kind of the lifespan or the creation of the show started at a particular point that you talked about, and I want to play something for you here and get your reaction. Here we go.
After more than 20 years in business and 2 years after opening our shiny new factory,
I do know this one.
I was running out of cash. All the stuff I thought would get better with the new baking facility. Margins, morale, quality, retention, customer service, sanitation practices. It all got worse. I truly failed to anticipate that scaling up in business can be a real recipe for disaster.
It was all about the puns, too.
I have to assume, knowing you now through the experience of this show, you're always very well prepared. Let's talk about December 3rd, 2021. That was your TED Talk debut. And we'll talk about TED Talk in just a second, but talk about the preparation. Talk about what you were going through leading up to that moment, because the one thing that I commend you for from a business perspective is you get to the point and you are transparent with opinion/issue/ good and bad. So in getting ready to talk in a room full of business enthusiasts, at the pinnacle of talking in the business world, TED, what was your preparation like?
Oh, I mean, that was really, the journey of it was much greater than the evening. And I was sort of blown away by it. I mean, I had submitted an application earlier that year. I think there was still a question because I want to say they picked the speakers in March or April of 21. So I guess there was still a question as to whether there was even going to be an event because we were still, coming out of the pandemic.
Post-COVID.
Post-COVID. And the TEDx St. Louis group, it's just an unbelievable group of people, and they took us through a series of classes, and they set us up with a coach, or in my case, there was actually two coaches. So sort of, here's the idea, and then I started to write it, and they would edit it, and then we would write it again, and just really kind of honing in on it. And it was a 6-month process. I mean, I probably gave that presentation 1,000 times to myself, and it was, I'm trying to remember, it was almost exactly 13 minutes long. And so that was about my commute from home to work. And so I'd do it on the way to work, I'd do it on the way home from work. But It was really, it was something that I'd always wanted to do. I've watched a million TED Talks. I think they're really great vehicles for, just take one idea, not try to tell a whole story about a whole bunch of different things, but just distill one thing that's super important and try to tell a story around it. And I thought it was a really neat experience that I would recommend to anybody.
Well, let me kind of point out what my takeaway just from 10,000 foot view of what impressed me the most is that you appeared to have no fear to address failure. You come right out of the gate, in the clip that we just played, and you're listening, go to YouTube, you can find it, TED Talk, Josh Allen, and you flat out say we were bleeding cash, and in summarizing that opening, the business wasn't doing well. And most people that are creators, innovators, and entrepreneurs like yourself, businesses are our babies. How hard was it for you to be that transparent on a stage with a microphone, with cameras, to admit that your baby was hurting?
It was a really interesting experience because candidly, certainly in the middle of COVID, we weren't out of the woods. I think a lot of people tell the story, the redemption story later, like this is how shitty things were, and then we turned it around, and this is how great things are now. And while we made a lot of inroads as it related to waste, and that's what the basis of that presentation was about, was the waste we were generating and how we fixed that. We certainly hadn't fixed all of the financial issues. We were going through a lot because it was COVID and we were a small business. So, but I don't think my grandfather told me, my dad told me, you don't learn anything from your successes. You learn everything from your failures. And so, it was an opportunity to share that and really understand it better for myself and teach that to the people that had joined our team and that were new to us. So the transparency wasn't uncomfortable, but it was really eye-opening to sort of go through that and kind of talk through it, even for myself.
So in preparation, because I know, via this show that you come with notes, you come with research, et cetera. When you were preparing for that TED Talk that kind of shifted maybe your mini global view of your own business and yourself, did you have a soundboard? Were you going to your dad for advice on this? Were you going to your sister or your, Mel, your wife? Or was this something that you internalized and then slowly brought to the public after the fact?
I think a lot of it was internal, and candidly, like I mentioned, the TEDx St. Louis organization was so helpful. We did practice sessions. We did it in front of the other speakers and shared in that, a couple of whom we've had on this show, actually. And so that experience sort of brings it about because you really want to make sure that there's no peripheral, like it's really honing in on that one idea and kind of talking that through. And so the organization did a great job of helping me through that. So it was certainly not a internal journey by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, so let's kind of connect the dots then, because it was a little over a year ago, probably about a year and a half ago. You and I were talking, and you kind of casually brought up the concept or the idea of what about a podcast, or what do you think, or how should I do it? Would you do it? What did the TED Talk? What did that experience? How did that play into maybe your interest in podcasts in general? What's the connectivity between the two? Was there a connection between the two? And if not, why a year and a half were you like, hey, well, what about a podcast?
I think, interestingly enough, I think what came out of the experience of going through this waste journey for us at the bakery was a couple, most specifically one unconventional metric that we've really hung our hat on. And we created this metric at the bakery called trash efficiency, which is sales divided by pounds of trash. So the idea was how efficient are we with our production, and then how much waste are we generating coming off of that? And recognizing that, look, we want to drive our trash numbers down, but if we're doubling the size of the business over a few years, there's sort of this expectation, well, trash or waste may go up just generally because you're selling more stuff. Well, what if we look at it relative to sales? What if we take that number and we look at this, what we call trash efficiency, that number, so that as we grow the business, are we generating less waste for every additional dollar in sales that we're doing? And it's been, we started, when we first started tracking that number, it was like $5.50 in sales for every pound of trash. We just crossed the $26 threshold. So we've moved that number 5 times, and it's been a really fascinating journey, and it comes from all these little incremental decisions. But finding that unconventional metric, I was curious if other people had those unconventional metrics. And I think the original idea that I came to you was that's what we were going to hone in on, were the idea of very specific metrics that maybe people were paying attention to that other people wouldn't normally pay attention to or hadn't talked about. And that's come up a little bit in the show, but it's evolved a little bit, I think, from that, in that it's really sort of this idea of kind of what's keeping people up at night, what are the challenges that they're facing in their business, and how are they doing it, because that's where we can share stories and opportunities for other folks to learn. And so I think it was just a curiosity. I mean, the whole thing for me came out of curiosity, and what I love about you is that you just eliminated the barrier to entry. Because when we were having a beer, I was like, I love to do this, and you're like, well, we could do it. Like you have,
I have microphones.
I got all the equipment.
Let's just hit record.
That's all we got to do, and so eliminating that barrier of entry then put it on me, sort of in the same way that the TED Talk, when I submitted the application, I wasn't sure about the process, but I submitted it, I was accepted, and then now we got to do it.
Yeah.
And sort of the same thing with the podcast. And so we reached out to a handful of folks, and knock on wood, we got a lot of people that were interested in kind of helping us launch it.
Well, let's not overly simplify. We reached out to a few folks. I mean, let's just, because when we were getting ready to do this, I knew out of the gate that consistency was going to be key. I told you, as far as like what my opinion was moving forward, like what is one thing we have to do? And I'm like, we just got to be consistent. You got to be predictable every Wednesday at 6 a.m. or whatever it's going to be. We have to be available. And you took on the task, you and Donna in the office, you took on the task of kind of creating that guest list. Okay, well, let's see what this looks like. I'm just going to read through the first 7-8 names here. Maxine Clark, Build-A-Bear, right? Katie Collier, Katie's Pizza, Gerard Kraft, Chief Flavor Officer, Kat Neville, Mark Hyman, who, we'll talk about him in a second, but Kevin Nashin, who was your neighbor and, is really a renowned award-winning chef. Your dad, Stanley Allen, and the list goes on and on. These are the first 7 or so in the list. You didn't come to the table with, I'm going to try this out. You brought true C-suite within their industries, innovators, extremely successful individuals. Was it the guest list early? Did it make it comfortable for you? Were you a little intimidated by these individuals? Was it, or did you pick safe spaces that just happen to be incredibly successful individuals?
I think, it goes back to the curiosity thing, right? Like if I'm going to have conversations with people, I want it to be with people that I really admire and respect. And knock on wood, being in business for 30 years in St. Louis, it's not a big town. I mean, I think we had a reputation. Maxine, I was thrilled that she agreed to do it, but she had been a customer of our Clayton Cafe. So I knew her from coming into the Clayton Cafe. And so when I reached out, she was willing to do it. She was just kind of, promoting the Del Mar Divine and the things that were happening down there. And so it was an opportunity for her to tell that story. Gerard has been a friend of mine for a long time, since he came to St. Louis. Obviously, the first James Beard winner for St. Louis, but, City was getting ready to launch their new season, and he was kind of part of that curation of what was happening there and what was happening at the Foundry. So, I hope that coming on the show helps folks amplify their message, and give them an opportunity to amplify their message. But also, I think, because of the relationship that I have with a lot of those people, they understood that my transparency, my vulnerability that I'm willing to share, and they certainly were willing to do it. I mean, Gerard's conversation about failure as a core value in his organization, to me, was one of the most fascinating sort of snippets that came out of this, because I didn't know that about the niche food group, that was something that they really embraced.
Well, okay, so hearing you say that out loud in real time, do you find it a little ironic now when you think about it and reflect on Gerard's episode in particular, where he talks about failure as core value? It was through your own company's path, failing in certain areas, that kind of brought you to this point, focusing on the TED Talk and the trash quotient, or whatever the formula is. Speak to failure generically, because in a lot of our conversations, it is funny that we hear anecdotes or experiences that these individuals have went through that are at the bottom, where they have failed, where they had to close a business. Zoom out a little bit. For that entrepreneur that's listening, or maybe a district manager who has a team and they're trying to avoid failure, what would you say to them about reacting to or accepting failure?
I have a tattoo on my arm of a T.S. Eliot quote, which is, if you aren't in over your head, how do you know how tall you are? So I think there's this sense of, for me anyway, that and again, maybe the Wayne Gretzky, I miss 100% of the shots I never take, right? Like I think putting yourself out there and taking shots at things and being vulnerable to whatever may come of that is the way, again, like I said, is how we learn, but it's also how we grow and find those opportunities. And I've closed more businesses than I run now. We had a bakery in Kansas City. We had multiple cafes that we've closed in St. Louis, and all of which were great chapters and stories and, part of the history of myself and my sister as entrepreneurs, but also just that's how we've learned. And I think that's just part of it. And I think that sometimes it would be easier to sit and not open another cafe, not open another business, not do another product line or something like that. But then we just don't know what we're missing if we don't take those chances. And so failure really is, that's really been the basis of a lot of these conversations, because I think that's where people, and maybe there's some misery loves company. So if I'm willing to share, they're willing to share. But that's where I think there's lessons and opportunities for.
So let me ask a follow-up question there, because through these conversations, a lot of individuals have told these stories of failure, and more importantly, what they did in response to it. And you have been extremely transparent in these bakeries failed. We had to close them. How did I know when it was time to close? Well, we were losing money. You're very to the point. Speak to when these stories that we've heard, when these people talk about, or when you hear about a business that is struggling, how important is it, in your opinion, to acknowledge that failure early in the process, so that you don't keep digging your hole? Because that's kind of what I'm extremely impressed by with you. You look to fix it, but if it's not fixable, the hardest thing in the world to do. It's like our Jason Balcom episode, right? Speak to not only acknowledging the failure, but what do you do about it?
Yeah, sometimes I think the most courageous decision is to close, and it took me closing a few of them to realize that. But let's take we had a bakery or cafe in the Central West End for not very long, for 2 years I think, and before we sort of realized that it wasn't going to work. But what we found was we kept sending our best resources down there. So it's not working. Okay, let's change the model. Let's open at night. Let's get a liquor license. Let's try to do some of these other things to see if we can't make it work in the West End. Well, that's not working. Well, let's take our best people in our organization and send them down there to try to fix it. And you sort of take a step back at some point and you go, wow, I'm taking my best people. Even if they knock it out of the park down there, they're going to turn this thing into a break-even. Like it still just doesn't make any sense. Like sometimes we just make bad decisions, or the timing isn't right, or the concept doesn't work for the neighborhood, or for whatever reason. And I think that notion, and I think Gerard did talk about that, and we talked about that with Jason Bachman with the Strange Donuts in Edwardsville. Like sometimes you just got to walk away. Like it just doesn't work. And it's hard with ego, right? Because our ego wants us to fix it. Our ego doesn't want to admit that we did something wrong or we made a mistake. And so for me, I think failing quickly is a virtue that we all have to pay attention to.
Well, I want to go back to the secret sauce, that kind of mission statement, that unspoken mission statement, because that's really where a lot of this was derived from. This whole platform was your secret sauce, or your trick to buck the trend was your trash program. And then talking about seeking out what do these individuals do that is unique, that helps address their metrics, whatever their metrics are that they're looking to focus on. And I go back to the Kevin Nashin episode, where here's Kevin, who's won James Beard Awards, just a tremendous individual on top of an incredible chef. But the thing that I have never forgotten about that episode was his metric. it wasn't food cost. It wasn't, how many turnovers. What's our margin on the the wasabi steak. It was his linen count. Talk about that episode and walk through his metric and how you reacted to hearing this incredibly successful chef was basically like, okay, how many bags of laundry do I have?
Yeah, I mean, it was really fascinating because he had talked about at the time early on, certainly early on with Sydney Street, before there was any other way to know how folks were going, that he was asking his Crown linen guy, how many bags did Tony's have last week? How many bags did you pick up from Gerard last week? And what he would measure his success against was the number of napkins or linen that they were washing on a weekly basis, to try to figure out in his head, how many covers did they do? How much volume are they doing? How am I doing relative to the folks that I admire and respect in the industry? And yeah, it was a really neat kind of pin that he dropped in the middle of that episode that I certainly wasn't expecting. Because Kevin's a guy, and he mentions it, like he's on his phone, he's looking at the sales. Now the technology allows him on his phone to know how server Joe is doing in Tulsa in the middle of lunch, and why are his tips down? Does that mean he's not giving good service? Is what's going on that's affecting the restaurant on a very granular basis? So he's paying attention to a lot of things, but he also has that ability to sort of take a step back and look at things and try to come up with ways to compare how he's doing to the marketplace. And the linen metric was really a pretty fascinating one.
Well, let me follow up on that, because you pointed out something, specifically technology. In all of these industries, all these people that we've spoke to, technology is front and center in their growth, whether it's a restaurant and they're checking the minute by minute sales in bookings, or if it's, found by the pound, right? Where they're tracking the global rates of, vintage t-shirts or whatever it is. Technology's right there. And I think everyone listening agrees that you cannot run your company today, whatever it is, without some form of technology. Let's go to the human element, though, the kind of human analysis process, because in these conversations, these individuals talk about the things that they do a little differently, what they pay attention to, who they pay attention to, whether it's trying to apply empathy into their process. For Maxine Clark, when she was talking about in-store staff, the kinds of people she was looking for people with empathy.
Sure.
Speak to that part of it, the human element of all of these businesses for an entrepreneur. To how important is it to focus on the human, to focus on the relationship, to focus on the emotions and things that are kind of embedded or, quote, baked in to the businesses?
Yeah, and certainly coming out of the pandemic, if we want to use that as kind of a watershed moment, I mean, it's changed a lot. I mean, we're 30, this is our 31st year in business, and I think we've always paid attention to our companions, as we refer to them. It's always been an important part of what we do, but maybe we took them for granted more than we certainly have since 2020. Like that all changed, and it became a much more important thing to pay attention to on all kinds of different levels, whether it was tracking retention and turnover, which we had never really paid attention to before, because it seemed to take care of itself, or what kind of benefits are we doing? What are the out-of-the-box ways of doing it? And I thought Tamara Keefe from Clementine's was amazing. Like that was a very eye-opening at what she does for her Clementine team, as she refers to them, and the family pictures that she organizes in the fall, so that folks who may not afford normally to take pictures with their family can come, and there's a photographer there taking pictures. And I thought many of the benefits, the really out-of-the-box thinking that she applied to her benefits program was really fascinating, and something that I learned a lot from kind of coming out of that conversation. And I know that's something that she's continued. We've stayed in touch since that episode, and things that she's continuing to do and try to refine and make a difference, because she has a lot of part-time kids even that are working, they're scooping ice cream. So this isn't, these aren't, she has a manufacturing facility and she has to take care of those people in a certain way, but she also has these customer-facing kids that she has to find that connection with and want to keep them and give them opportunities for growth. And so I thought she was terrific in that. And again, something that sort of came out of these conversations, maybe I was searching for a metric, and she really turned that around to the human element that you're mentioning.
Well, no, I totally agree, because the one thing that in preparing, and you know me, Josh, I don't typically do homework, but I'm like, Josh always does homework, so I have to do a little homework here. You've talked to individuals from the ice cream industry, direct to consumer, selling scoops, to vintage T-shirt resale, to bank nonprofits, all over the board, fast food franchising, and when I look at all these industries, the face value is, it would appear there are such unique issues and struggles within those industries that are varying levels of employee skill or workforce or trade or experience. And the one thing that it feels as if 50 episodes in, like all 49 of the previous guests, they have some commonality, even though their industries are so siloed, so unique within their verticals. If you were to try and describe or point out from a Venn diagram standpoint where they overlap, what would that be? What is the common denominator with these individuals that we've spoken to, regardless of industry?
Look, I think successful people take care of their people. I mean, I think that's, it's not rocket science. We're not saying something but I think the empathy that they have towards their own teams and their desire to grow their teams. And I've been very candid about it, and many people on the show have been candid, that sometimes you reach a point as a small, medium-sized business owner where, look, this is enough. Like, maybe I'm making the money I need to make, or the size of the organization is where I thought it would be. But if I want to keep my people and I want to give them personal and professional opportunities to keep growing, the business has to keep moving forward. And growth, I mean, I do believe that businesses are either growing or dying. Maybe you can sit for 15 minutes at that sort of unique threshold between the two, but you got to keep going one way or another, or your folks they're going to find other places to go to find that development for themselves. And so that's the challenge. And I think everybody that we talk to, really bar none, I mean, that's what they're thinking about. They're thinking about their folks, how to take care of them. And maybe it is unique to this post-COVID kind of time that, we launched the show, sort of everybody was sort of coming out of that. But it's still, for many people, staffing is still a challenge. We're still facing some challenges. Certainly turnover numbers that are higher than they ever were pre-pandemic. Even though they're better, they're not great. And so we're sort of forced to think about things differently. And so maybe there's the uniqueness to the time in which we launched the show. But no question. I mean, my cousin Andy Cohen was on the show, and even he's talking about the people that work for him and how they make these shows, and then it's not just him, and the creativity and so kind of across the board, that's what folks are thinking about. How do they take care of the team around them, and how do they use that team to continue to move forward?
Well, that reminds me of the episode with John Franco, and over at Gorilla 76, industrial marketing agency. I was really taken aback in the conversation regarding work from home, remote work, and how they as a traditional agency, and not a traditional agency, but they're adapting to this post-COVID world. And more importantly, the next wave of workers, they have much different expectations as far as what a company should be providing them, what they should be paying attention to. And to your point, I think that the human element in all these individuals, like, they all seem to just really like their people. It kind of comes down to almost being that simple.
Right. I think that's that. I think, maybe large businesses are the same. I mean, I would say certainly Maxine, Delmar Divine is not that size, but certainly, her experience at Build-A-Bear is a sort of a different animal relative to anybody else that we spoke to. Most of the people are very actively involved daily in their businesses. Many people in the hospitality industry that we spoke with obviously can't do remote work. I mean, we're in the customer-facing business, or either manufacturing something, and so we got to be there making it, or they're customer-facing in a restaurant environment. But yeah, I think that active involvement, you're going to surround yourself with these folks that you're working 8, 10, 12 hours a day with, and you want to like each other.
50 episodes in, we talked earlier about kind of the why out of the gate, why you wanted to start it, and what you were hoping to gather from the experience. Because there was still a lot of question marks as far as what does this really mean, right? I'm spending money on marketing and branding, but I really don't know what I'm getting out of it. I can't create a direct line between that spend and my business. From a podcast perspective, you now have spent a lot of time preparing for episodes, interviewing, listening back, kind of critiquing yourself and talking to these heavyweights. What's your why now as it applies to the podcast for Baked In and Josh Allen? Why do the podcast?
Well, I'm still really enjoying the conversations. I enjoy the research process, kind of that deep dive. And in general, it's, 2 to 3 hours, the couple of days before these conversations take place. And we tend to do them, we try to do them in little bunches so that we knock out a few and have something in the can. So we're not, scrambling every week to put something together, but sometimes we're scrambling sort of depending on how the calendar falls. But, I have a 15-year-old, as you know, who plays soccer. So I spend a lot of time at the soccer park watching practice.
I know that well.
And so, there is the time does exist to do that, research. The internet is a pretty wonderful thing between LinkedIn and just, so the deep dive is still really fascinating to me. The conversations are fascinating. I would love to be able to invite the group that have been on here to go have a cup of coffee, but it just doesn't, it's hard to make that work. So it does work for them because I do hope that, again, like I mentioned, that we can amplify something for them, whether it's a new opening, a new story, just something with what they're doing. They're all great people and, deserve continued success. So if we can help in a very minute way with the show. So, the why is just continuing the conversations. The feedback continues to be good. The people that I talk to who listen would love more feedback. Leave a review, hit the follow button. But
it's all free, right?
But the feedback continues to be strong, and still looking, what's next in terms of, there's certainly plenty of tremendous St. Louisans in which we continue to have these conversations with. We're starting to look a little bit regional and outside of it to see who's next. National, it's interesting to see. I would say that if we look at the list, half have been in the hospitality business probably because that's certainly the industry from which I come from. Yeah. Or touch it in a certain way. And I love those conversations, but I also love the conversations with the Mark Hymans and who had the classic car company and Rick Wolf with Found by the Pound. And so as long as I keep enjoying this, and you're willing to keep helping me do it, it certainly seems to be something that will continue for a time.
Well, so one thing I want to point out and kind of get your reflective take on it, because as we sit here with a camera, this one will be on YouTube as well. Hi, YouTube. You're repping the STL hat. You were just talking about, some of these businesses here that a lot of people don't even know exist. For example, Mike Conzen and PGAV, who we just had in the previous episode. One thing that, again, I'm going to commend you is you are an advocate for St. Louis. And my question is, after all of these conversations, and you've been in the food and beverage industry for 30 years, right? You kind of know the underbelly in most cool cities. Culturally speaking, that it starts with food and rock and roll and those kind of things, and it percolates up in a lot of cases. Now that you've talked to all these individuals and you've learned about PGAV and Mark Hyman and his globally renowned classic boutique car company, how do you feel about St. Louis? What does it make you feel from a pride standpoint, from a development standpoint, from a cultural standpoint? Based on these conversations.
Yeah, and you and I talked a lot about the list, of who were the kind of the wish list. Yeah. And we never really wanted it to be St. Louis focused. I don't think that was the intention going in. But I've been just so amazed and kind of in awe of some of the folks that we've spoken with that could be doing this in a lot of places. So Mike is a great example. PGAV does, destination design work, 120 million visitors on 5 continents every year of places that they've designed. And Chris Ryan from Once Films, who we just had on, who tells amazing stories, and many of which are about St. Louis, but they're also about places outside of St. Louis. And Brian Lagerstrom, who's now a YouTube chef. I mean, he was a St. Louis chef that I knew through the industry, but he's now on YouTube. Nobody knows where he's not promoting St. Louis in that, but he's telling his story to 1.2 million people, across the globe, teaching them how to cook. And these things are happening here, and it's amazing to me. I'm much more prideful of St. Louis 50 episodes in than I think I was before. And obviously being a small business owner in St. Louis, I always love St. Louis. I think it's a great environment in which to raise a family and in which to raise a business. I think it's incredibly supportive. If you do the right thing and you learn and you put the energy into it, it gives you that energy in return here that, I haven't done it in any other places, so maybe I don't know, but I've heard that it isn't necessarily the case in other cities. But I'm, leaning into the St. Louis thing now more than ever. And look, there's some great St. Louis podcasts that are St. Louis focused. I mean, in the title and sort of in the way they go about doing things. And I just want to tell different stories. And so it's through the business piece, through the metrics piece, through those conversations that we're trying to look at it differently. But honestly, to answer that question, I mean, I'm more intrigued and excited about the city, I think, than I certainly was when we started this.
It's funny because I kind of glean a real-time parallel between Soccer Dad Pod, my show, and your show because, in the soccer world, obviously St. Louis it's a mecca. It is a historical mecca and is currently still producing high-level individuals that are in that world. And Baked In has basically... I watch it because St. Louis gets a rap. We get a rap. Press usually more than not is not favorable, and and there's a lot of reasons for that. But we've seen more good press through Explore STL and Greater St. Louis Inc. and all these other organizations that have really put their foot on the gas pedal in trying to tell these stories, and you're part of that now. So my question to you is, as we grow the show, as we look at finding those intriguing individuals, will you go into those conversations kind of with like a St. Louis lens on it? Because we are one of those cities that's like, yeah, but look at us now. Do you think that that's helped hone your interviewing skills? Potentially with these people that we're going to be bringing in from out of market? It's
a really interesting question. I don't know the answer. I mean, you who have listened to the interviews could probably answer the question better if you think that's the case. I mean, I certainly don't go into it with that. We don't talk a lot about origin story or anything like that or what St. Louis has done. I mean, we certainly could lean on that a little bit more, I guess. But I think there's that Midwest sensibility that I try to bring to the show and the hospitality piece, just because that's the nature of how my mom taught me and how my dad taught me, and sort of like our upbringing, sort of in food and service. So not necessarily specific to St. Louis, but certainly because of the kinds of people that we've talked to, it certainly comes up in the episodes if it makes sense for them. And these folks in general are finding success in this region. And some have found the same success in other places. Kevin, as an example, in Tulsa, and Katie, who you mentioned, is looking to expand. Gerard's got a place in Nashville. Like I think there are the roots starting here and growing out further.
So let me ask you a question specific to the podcast from a business perspective, because when we were rolling this out, we did go down the road of addressing, okay, what is the purpose from a marketing / branding standpoint? Because one of the questions that most people ask you when they walk in the room, whether it was out at the bakery or here in the new studio, is always like, how did you get into this? Why did you get into this? And we've touched on it a little bit from a macro perspective. Speak to how you view the podcast as it relates to you, your own brand, you, Josh Allen, or Companion, Josh and Companion. Have you seen a difference in how maybe people are engaging you on social media, or maybe in the grocery store or at the cafe when they see you, hey, I listened to the podcast, or I heard about the podcast? Has it affected maybe your own view of your brand through these conversations?
Maybe. I do think it lends... I try to lend credibility to myself as a leader, and I think that it helps with that, with the bakery. I mean, I think there's a peripheral benefit to Companion in telling these stories. And again, we've leaned because we've leaned somewhat into the hospitality industry, at least with a portion or maybe not a majority, about half of the episodes, some of whom are customers of the bakery, I really try to do my best to not talk about the business relationship that we have. But look, I am trying to sometimes amplify the message of a customer who's been supportive of our organization. And sometimes people surprise me when they say they listen, because I certainly don't know. I mean,
it is weird at first when people are like, hey, I listened to you on the podcast.
And look, we pay attention to the metrics on the show, and it's not huge numbers that we're drawing. It's a nice amount of people that are listening to the show, but not necessarily enough that somebody's going to recognize me. Now that we made the change to YouTube,
to your point though, you said it earlier. You believe that businesses are going in two directions: either they're failing or they're growing, and there's that short 15-minute period in which they might be stagnant or flat and safe. The show is growing. I mean, metrics don't lie. So let me just ask you this. Where would you like to see it go? Like you've garnered a lot in a year's time through these conversations. If and I know that you prepare. You're very methodical in how you approach your business and a lot of other things. What are you preparing for with the podcast moving forward, be it from guest strategy, messaging strategy, or is it just you just want to add more chapters to this book that is educational?
I think, there's no way to know, right? And I think Brian's episode about YouTube and his success, 3 years of 30 to 60 hours a week, not having anything monetized, and then all of a sudden it changes when you hit a certain threshold. So I don't go into it with the thought that anything in the short term is going to be there. I mean, knock on wood, Busey Bank has been supportive of the show. I'm thrilled because, one, it allows me to pay you. And
thank you, Busey.
and just the fact that there's some legitimacy to the stories that we're telling that they think has value. And look, I've had a relationship, as I mentioned, every week for 17 years with Busey, so they've been a great partner to me, and I'm thrilled that they've been able to help. And so that makes it a little easier, right? Like, it's not money out of pocket. That at least it's been able to handle the production costs and sort of allow us to keep telling the stories. I don't have any, to speak to the growing thing. I mean, I guess it's not the angle, but the slope, right? As long as it keeps moving up, and meaning that it's resonating with more people and we're finding more people interested in listening, then I think we keep doing it, right? And if we start to see that stop, that growth, or go the other direction, then maybe we're not telling the kind of stories that are valuable. And so I don't have there's no metric that it has to be X number of downloads a week or follows or something like that. I don't want to get too wrapped up in that because I do have a full-time job. But
well, let me ask you to answer this question, because I often get questions from individuals that are like thinking the same as you were, like, well, I think I might want to do a podcast. I don't know how to do it. I don't know what I would talk about, blah, 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 blah. And these are typical questions when people are just trying to create content in general, because that's really what this is. You're creating content just within the lane of podcasts, which have absolutely blown up over the past 10 years. So my question to you is this: how have these conversations and this process changed the way that you operate today? Do you feel that they have helped affect the way that you operate and run Companion? Or would you say that maybe it's more introspective, that it's changing the way that maybe you, Josh Allen, as an individual, maybe the way that you operate or how you approach issues, and then by default does it funnel right back into the business? I
think it's both. I mean, certainly the Tamara episode we talked about, we've had a couple of benefit things that we've done that have sort of come out of conversations from the podcast, trying different things to see. We did pictures with Santa this year for our folks, for their kids, which was a direct result of having that conversation on the show. But I think the lessons that I'm learning and the way that I'm hearing people approach their problems and what keeps them up at night and what challenges they're facing definitely changes the way I operate as a leader. So I think it's been beneficial in both of those respects. I think you were starting to ask me before, and maybe I'll try to answer it too, like the idea of would you do it again, or would you keep doing it with the goal? It's a lot of work. I mean, there's no production work, knock on wood. We have the conversation and then all of a sudden it magically shows up on the interwebs. But the time that it takes to reach out to get something on the calendar, to get something scheduled, to explain what we're trying to accomplish, to work through somebody's agency or
Right.
directly, and then the research and that piece. I mean, you really, before you would want to sit behind the microphone, you better really be excited about those conversations, because it's not easy to do, and there really is no. There's no promise that there's much of anything in return. You don't know there's 2 million podcasts in the world. Like, you don't know that anybody's going to listen. You don't know that.
You also, though, it's not as if, like, you know, in my world on the other show, it's pretty easy for me to find another mom or dad and say, hey, you've got time to kill. Let's just have beers and talk. You're going after innovators. You're talking to, you know, like Curtis over at the racetrack. That is not an easy individual to get a hold of and get on a calendar. And so I think, to give you credit, the calendar has been amazing. The guest list has been amazing. So my question is along those lines. It is a lot of work to manage it. Would you say that the process has kind of like supplemented your own marketing, your own branding, so that it's not necessarily an additional expense on top of everything? Do you funnel this whole process into what you now view as your messaging strategy from a business perspective?
No, because I don't think there's enough crossover to companion. Like, I think it, as a leader and as a networker in St. Louis, I think it has some value, absolutely. But I don't look at it as part of the marketing budget for the bakery. I just think it's too disparate, and it doesn't really make sense from that perspective. My hope is that the momentum of the show, if there is any, and if it continues, makes that scheduling easier, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I'm sure, and I know I follow your podcast, and you go from having me on as a dad to having, Tab Ramos, Hall of Famer. Like,
you beat him. You beat him. So,
but I mean, as we start to generate more interest in the show and more people, it becomes easier. The Mike Conzen, as we mentioned, from PGAV, was a direct result of talking to Dr. Jody Sell from the History Museum, because he had done work there, and we got connected that way. And so it's getting a little easier to have those conversations, and certainly agencies out there, if they're listening or paying attention to media in the marketplace, have reached out and said, hey, I've got a couple of potential guests that make sense, and sometimes those guests do make sense. And
it's turning into that 1B question. 1A is, what high school did you go to? And 1B is, well, were you on Josh Allen's Baked In? So
we're not quite there yet.
Hey, I have a couple fun questions before we wrap it up here, because the numbers tell us that people get disinterested after about 3/4 of an hour.
So we can talk about anything now?
Yeah, we can talk about anything now. I want to get into, I'm going to come full circle back to TED Talk. Fast forward to today, and let's say 6 months from now, TED says, hey, we love what you did. We'd like to have you back. What would you like to talk about? After this process, if you had to pick a subject matter, maybe, for the sake of our podcast that has to relate to the podcast, what would you talk about in a TED Talk to burgeoning entrepreneurs?
Wow. I think the challenge with the TED Talk is it's a very unique thing, and I don't know that I can pull one out of the hat. I do think that paying attention to people and the way that we've tried to attack the problem of turnover and retention and create a compelling environment for folks of newer generations and older generations, and in a manufacturing environment where work's not easy and it's hard, maybe something that we would distill out of that experience, which really has amplified and changed for us in the last 10% of the history of the bakery.
Yeah.
I think it would be something along those lines.
Final question. We're going to have fun. Well, actually, no, I take that back, because I just thought of one too. I love the whole concept of it, right? We talk about this all the time in the world of sport. That guy has it. That girl has it on the court or on the field. If you were to describe it within the realm, within the context of your guest list, what is that?
I think it's curiosity. I really think that the folks to me that are most fascinating and that I admire the most and that continue to grow and do things they're just curious people. And I think that curiosity is what got them to sit down with me and have the conversation, right? Because they didn't know necessarily what it was going to be about or what it was going to incorporate, but they knew me or respected me enough or had listened to another episode and it made sense. And so they were curious about that experience. And so I think people that are curious are the ones that I'm most intrigued have conversations with. And I think you're that way for me, which I've really enjoyed your curiosity as it relates to just sort of where can we take this thing? How do we do this? How do we put it together? So that to me has been sort of that running theme that has kind of gone down the 49 episodes before today.
Final question.
As long as it's not about music. So you do that whole thing on your show.
No,
it's not a name that tune thing?
No, so like I said, this is the most I've ever prepared for an episode, and I just crossed out a lot of stuff. I'm like, no, that's to us. I'm curious. Your wish list, your guest wish list. If you could ping one, like a super whale. No offense, Andy, you're a whale, but just a different kind of whale. If you had the one, who would you love to we would extend it into a 2-hour special? Whose brain do you just want to dissect?
There's two people that come to mind right away, and they're actually both very connected to St. Louis, though they're doing other stuff. I think Danny Meyer is somebody who I have the ultimate respect for. I know he has great relationships with many of the folks that have been on the show, so it would be great to talk to him, especially sort of in the later in his career now and sort of how he views things. And I think Bob Costas would be the same for me also. So I think, he's the ultimate curious. I mean, he had his own show, and he was so compelling for me to watch on TV and kind of growing up watching him through the Olympics and in all of those sports, and sort of how he sees the landscape now with streaming, and like the whole world is changing as it relates to media, and it would be really interesting to get his take on what's happening there.
Yeah, he's went from rotary phone to today.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. And he has survived all of that, right?
Well, Josh, this has been a blast.
So if anybody knows either of those two and can help us.
There you go. Yes. Finder's fees are welcome. How many sourdough loaves would you like? So this has been a blast, man. I really appreciate not only the opportunity to work with you on this, because number one, you're a friend, but number two, it's just fun, and I have a kind of a moral / mission statement of my own. Like, if it's not fun, don't do it. And this is definitely fun. So thank you for your time, and, best of luck with the next 200 episodes. And you will talk to the listeners next time.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll get some messages that they'd like to hear more from you in the future.
All right. Take care, Josh.
Thanks, JB. Thanks so much for joining me today. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed sharing these insights from folks I truly admire. Be sure and follow the show in your favorite podcast player to be alerted to newly released episodes. And share a comment if you have any feedback or future contributor recommendations.